The first thing my son said to me after his father's funeral wasn't, "Are you okay, Mom?" But where are the bank statements? He didn't even have the decency to take off his funereal black tie, which he tugged loose at the neck. It hung there like a little black noose, a perfect symbol for the way he was choking the last bit of air from the room, from my lungs. My daughter, Sarah, stood behind him, wringing her hands, her face a mask of practiced sorrow. Her eyes, however, darted around the living room, not with grief, but with the cold, assessing gaze of an auctioneer tallying up the price of the furniture. My husband, Robert, had been in the ground for less than 4 hours. His presence, which had once filled every corner of this grand old house with a booming authority, was now a chilling, echoing silence. A silence my children seemed determined to fill with the clatter of coins. Comment on which city you're watching and subscribe to the channel because I guarantee there's more to this story than meets the eye. "Daniel, for heaven's sake," I whispered, my voice a dry rustle of leaves. It was hoarse not just from a day of forced pleasantries and real tears, but from the 50 years of swallowed words that preceded it. My body ached with a weariness that had nothing to do with my 70 years and everything to do with the half-century I had spent as the moon to Robert's sun, orbiting his immense gravity, my own light a mere reflection of his. "It has to be now, Mom," Daniel insisted, taking a step forward onto the Persian rug Robert had prized. He was his father's son, all sharp angles and sharper ambition. Robert had forged him, molding him into a perfect replica of his own relentless drive. Dad was meticulous. He would want us to handle his affairs promptly. No sentiment, just efficiency. "We need to see the will, the portfolio, the deeds." Sarah, ever the dutiful echo, nodded in agreement. "We're just worried about you, Mom. It's too much for you to handle alone." Her sympathy was a veil so thin it was transparent, barely concealing the same greedy glint that shone in her brother's eyes. They weren't looking at their grieving mother, they were looking at a gatekeeper, an obstacle standing between them and the comfortable life their father's death had promised them. In their eyes, I saw it with a brutal clarity. My role as mother had expired along with my husband. I was now just the keeper of the keys. The air in the house grew thick with unspoken things, heavy as the velvet drapes Robert had insisted on. For years, this grand home on Maple Avenue had been our family's stage, and he the director of every scene. It was where we'd celebrated birthdays with towering cakes he'd chosen and Christmases with a tree that scraped the ceiling, decorated with ornaments he'd approved. It was where he had held court, his leather armchair a throne from which he dispensed wisdom and judgment in equal measure. But for me, it had also been a place of quiet compromises and bitten tongues. Every antique vase, every polished silver frame held a memory. But now, under my children's avaricious gaze, they were just items on an inventory list. They were no longer treasures. They were assets. My life's work of creating a home had been demoted to curating a museum they were eager to liquidate. "The lawyer has the will," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the emotion that was churning inside me. "Mr. Abernathy. He'll call us to set up a meeting next week." "We've already called him," Sarah chimed in, a little too quickly, betraying their coordinated attack. "He said Dad left everything in a primary trust, with you as the executor." "That means you have all the paperwork, Mom. Here, in the house." I stared at her, my heart sinking not with a gentle weight, but with the sickening plummet of a stone in a well. They had gone behind my back on the very day of their father's funeral. The betrayal was a sharp, physical pain, a fresh wound layered upon the gaping one of my widowhood. Daniel saw the look on my face and his expression didn't soften. It hardened. "We're not trying to be difficult," he said in a tone that meant he was about to be extremely difficult. "But Dad mentioned a private account a few times. A substantial one. We just want to make sure everything is accounted for. For your sake, of course. To make sure you're protected." Protected. The word was a bitter joke that caught in my throat. For 50 years, I had been the one doing the protecting. I had protected my children from their father's volcanic temper, which could erupt over a misplaced newspaper or a C on a report card. I protected them from his crushing expectations, from the chilling silences that followed his rages, silences that were somehow louder and more terrifying than the shouting. I had built a wall of warmth and love around them, a carefully constructed illusion of a happy home, papering over the cracks in the foundation with cookies and bedtime stories. And now they stood before me, two perfect strangers forged in their father's image, ready to tear down that wall brick by brick to get to the gold they believed was hidden behind it. My feet carried me, as if on their own, to the mahogany desk that had been Robert's sanctuary, his fortress. My hand trembled as I touched the cool, polished wood. His scent still lingered there, a mix of old paper, leather, and the faint, sweet smell of the pipe tobacco he'd quit a decade ago but could never quite scrub from the room. "Everything is in here," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of steel as I gestured to the locked drawers. "But it can wait. Tonight, we should be remembering your father, not his money." "Remembering him is exactly what we're doing," Daniel counted, his voice losing its patient facade. The veneer of the grieving son was peeling away. "He built an empire for us, Mom. He worked himself into an early grave for this family. The best way to honor him is to secure his legacy." His legacy. I almost laughed, a hysterical, brittle sound. They had no idea what their father's true legacy was. They saw the successful businessman, the pillar of the community who sat on 3 different charity boards, the man who provided them with European vacations and private school educations. They didn't see the man behind the closed doors, the man whose love was a currency to be earned and bartered, never given freely. His legacy wasn't in stocks and bonds. It was in the fear he'd so carefully planted in my heart, a fear that had taken root and grown for half a century, its vines wrapping around my very bones. A small, ornate wooden box sat on the corner of the desk. Carved from sandalwood, it was a gift I'd given Robert on our 10th anniversary. He kept it locked, always. He'd told me it held sentimental items. I had never once seen him open it. Daniel's eyes, his father's eyes, fixed on it. "What's in there?" "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "Your father kept it private." "Well, he's gone now," Daniel said, his hand reaching for it with an air of ownership that made my skin crawl. "There are no more secrets." "Oh, my dear boy," I thought, a cold dread washing over me, as chilling as a winter draft through these old window panes. "You have no idea how wrong you are. The secrets in this house are the only things holding it up. And if you start pulling at the threads, everything is going to come crashing down." The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Daniel and Sarah were relentless. They treated my grief as an inconvenience, a senile woman's sentimentality that was getting in the way of practical matters. They hired an estate appraiser without consulting me, a severe-looking woman who moved through my home with a clipboard and a cold, measuring eye, placing little colored stickers on my memories. The grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from my parents who had disapproved of Robert, was labeled Lot 24. The porcelain dolls my grandmother had left me, their painted faces like little ghosts of my own childhood, became Lot 78. My life was being dismantled, cataloged, and priced out before my very eyes. I retreated into myself, floating through the days in a fog of sorrow and disbelief. I found myself wandering from room to room, touching the furniture, trying to hold onto good memories, the ones I had fought so hard to create. One afternoon, a flashback hit me with the force of a wave. Robert and I, newly married, were dancing in this very living room to a scratchy Frank Sinatra record on a turntable. He had spun me around, laughing, his eyes full of a light I hadn't seen in decades. "To us, Eleanor," he'd whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "We're going to have it all." He was right. We had it all, and it had cost us everything. My children interpreted my quiet detachment as weakness, as confirmation that I was not fit to handle the estate. "Mom, you seem confused," Sarah would say, her voice dripping with a cloying, false concern that was more insulting than Daniel's open aggression. "Let us handle the paperwork. You just rest." It was a gentle coup, a velvet-gloved power grab. They wanted me out of the way, a silent, nodding figurehead while they carved up their father's kingdom. One afternoon, while the appraiser was cataloging the silver in the dining room, the clinking of spoons like a death knell, I was in Robert's study, looking for an old photo album. My hands brushed against a loose floorboard beneath the desk, one I'd never noticed before. My heart skipped a beat. Robert was a man of bank vaults and fireproof safes. A loose floorboard seemed too crude, too desperate for him. Curiosity, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years, got the better of me. With my nail file, I pried it open. Inside, nestled in the dark, dusty space, was not a wad of cash or hidden bonds, but a small, worn leather-bound journal. My hands shook as I opened it. It was Robert's handwriting, but from a long, long time ago. The early years of our marriage. The entries started with love and hope, but quickly the tone began to shift, to darken. He wrote about his burgeoning business, about a partner named Frank, and about deals that sounded less like business and more like threats. One entry stood out, dated just after Daniel was born. Frank is a liability. He has a soft heart and a loud mouth. A man who can't control his own sentiment can't be trusted with a fortune. He needs to be handled. I slammed the book shut, my blood running cold. Frank Rizzo. I remembered him. A cheerful, kind man with a booming laugh who had been Robert's best friend and business partner. He had disappeared a year later. Robert had told everyone, including the police, that Frank had run off with a pile of company money, leaving him to pick up the pieces. Robert had played the part of the betrayed friend perfectly. Everyone had pitied him. I had pitied him. I had held him while he cried crocodile tears over his friend's betrayal. And all this time, the truth was festering right under my feet. This discovery changed everything. My grief for Robert curdled into something else, something dark and complex. I wasn't just mourning a difficult husband. I was mourning the entire life I thought I'd had, the man I thought I'd married. The secrets weren't just about money. They were about the very foundation our family was built upon, a foundation of lies, cruelty, and something far, far worse. Daniel and Sarah, oblivious, continued their campaign. Their next target was the small, locked wooden box on the desk. We need to know what's in it. Mom, Daniel insisted during his daily visit, holding it up as if it were evidence. It could contain keys to a safe deposit box, or a deed or contact information we need. Leave it alone, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. The box, which I'd once seen as a symbol of Robert's private sentiments, now felt like a Pandora's box of his sins. I didn't want it opened. I didn't want to know what other horrors were locked away. Why are you being so secretive? Sarah accused, her brow furrowed. It's like you're trying to hide something from us. The irony was a knife twisting in my gut. My mind, unlocked by the journal, began replaying scenes from my marriage through this new, horrifying lens. I remembered arguments that ended with a hole punched in a wall, which Robert would calmly have repaired the next day, telling me I was overly emotional for being upset. I remembered the times he would come home late, his knuckles bruised, claiming he'd had car trouble. I remembered the way he would look at me sometimes, a coldness in his eyes that I had always mistaken for stress or fatigue. I had spent 50 years living with a monster and had been too scared, too dependent, too brainwashed to see it. I had been a willing prisoner in my own home. One evening, after my children had left, the oppressive silence of the house descended upon me. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know. I found the spare key to Robert's desk, a tiny brass key he thought I didn't know about, hidden behind a framed photo of us on our wedding day. The bitter symbolism did not escape me. I waited until midnight, the house groaning around me. The key slid into the lock of the top drawer with a soft, conspiratorial click. Inside, beneath a pile of old tax returns, was a bundle of letters tied with a faded pink ribbon. They were not business letters. They were from a woman named Maria. Love letters. Passionate, desperate letters spanning 30 years. Maria wrote about their secret meetings in a small apartment across town, about the child they had together, a son named Leo. She wrote about the money Robert sent her every month, enough to live on but never enough to be free. She begged him to leave me, to be a real father to their son. The last letter was dated 6 months ago. The handwriting was shaky, stained with what looked like tears. Robert, it read, Leo is sick. The doctors say it's serious. It's a rare blood disorder. I've used all the money you sent on specialists. I need more. Please, for your son, help us. I sat there on the floor of my husband's study. The letters spread around me like fallen leaves, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty cold. He didn't have another life. He had a whole other family. A family he had kept in the shadows, a son who was sick, a woman who had loved the man I never truly knew. The private account my children were so obsessed with, it wasn't for investments. It was hush money. It was the price of a woman's silence and a boy's life. This was Robert's legacy. Not an empire, but a prison of his own making, with multiple inmates. And the money my children were fighting for? It was stained with a lifetime of deceit. The next day, Daniel and Sarah arrived with a new strategy. They had a lawyer with them, a slick young man named Mr. Graves, whose suit cost more than my car. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and condescension that made my blood boil. "Mrs. Miller," he began, his voice smooth as oil on a placid lake. "Your children are concerned. They feel you are not fully capable of managing an estate of this complexity. They are proposing we petition the court to have Daniel appointed as co-executor. It's just a formality, of course, to help you with the burden." The burden? The word hung in the air. My entire life had been a burden. The burden of a difficult husband, the burden of a loveless marriage, the burden of secrets I didn't even know I was keeping. And now, the burden of my own children's greed. Something inside me snapped. A quiet, 50-year-old dam of patience, fear, and sorrow finally broke. I stood up, and for the first time in years, I felt the strength in my spine. My back was straighter than it had been in decades. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a gunshot. Daniel stared at me. "Mom, be reasonable." "I have been reasonable for 50 years, Daniel," I said, my voice gaining strength with every syllable. "I have been quiet. I have been accommodating. I have been the perfect wife and the perfect mother. And I am done." I walked to the desk, picked up the small, locked wooden box, and turned to face them, the lawyer, all of them. "You want to know what's in here? You want to know all of your father's secrets? Fine. I didn't have the key for this box. I never did. But I knew where Robert kept a small hammer for hanging pictures. I walked calmly to the kitchen drawer, retrieved it, and returned to the living room. I placed the box on the sturdy oak coffee table, and before anyone could stop me, I brought the hammer down on it with all the pent-up force my 70-year-old body could muster. The wood splintered with a satisfying crack that echoed through the silent house. Subscribe now, you won't believe the twist that's coming. Inside the box, there was no key, no deed, no secret bank account number. There was just one thing, a single yellowed photograph. It was a picture of me, taken on our honeymoon. I was young, maybe 20 years old, laughing, my head thrown back in genuine, unadulterated joy. I looked happy. I looked free. I looked like a person I hadn't seen in a lifetime. Tucked behind the photo was a small, folded piece of paper. Daniel, recovering from his shock, snatched it up. His face, already pale, went ashen as he read it. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her hand flying to her mouth as a small gasp escaped her lips. It was a prenuptial agreement. One I had never seen before. One I had certainly never signed. It was dated a week before our wedding. It stipulated that in the event of a divorce, I would receive nothing. No house, no alimony, no share of the business that I had supported from the very beginning. My signature was on the bottom line, a clumsy, obvious forgery. "Your father didn't trust love," I said, my voice calm and clear, cutting through their shock. "He only trusted control. He made sure, from the very beginning, that I could never leave him." This box wasn't a collection of his sentimental memories. It was a reminder, a threat. It was his way of telling me, every single day, that I belonged to him. The room was silent, save for the sound of my own breathing, which for the first time in a long time felt deep and even. The carefully constructed image of their father, the great provider, the family man, was cracking right before their eyes. But I wasn't finished. The foundation had to be razed to the ground. "You talk about his legacy," I continued, my gaze sweeping from Daniel to Sarah, their faces a mixture of confusion and horror. "You want to know about the money? Let me tell you about the money." I told them everything. I told them about Frank, the partner their father had ruined and cast aside after, I suspected, blackmailing him into silence, the truth of which lay buried in that journal. I told them about the rages, the emotional abuse, the cold, calculating way he had isolated me from my own family and friends over the years. And then I walked to the desk, retrieved Maria's letters, and laid them out on the coffee table next to the shattered box. "This is your father's other legacy," I said softly. "A woman named Maria." And a son. Your brother. A boy named Leo who is very, very sick. Sarah started to cry, soft, gulping sobs of a child who has just learned there is no Santa Claus. Daniel just stood there, his face a stony mask, the forged document still clutched in his hand. The empire he so desperately wanted to inherit was a mirage, a kingdom built on cruelty and lies. The money wasn't a blessing, it was a curse. The private account you're so desperate to find, I said, delivering the final blow. I found it years ago. Robert was a creature of habit. His passwords were all the same, our anniversary, a date he clearly didn't hold very sacred. It took me a month of quiet evenings after he was asleep, but I got in. And for the last 10 years, I have been slowly, carefully draining it. Daniel's head snapped up. You what? That's illegal. That was our inheritance. Your inheritance? I laughed, a raw, painful sound that was also strangely liberating. That was my survival. That was my penance. Do you think I could live in this house, wearing the clothes he bought me, eating the food he paid for, knowing it was the price of another man's ruin? Knowing he had a whole other family hidden away in the shadows of our perfect life? I looked him straight in the eye. I didn't keep it. I didn't spend it on jewels or trips. I gave it away. Every single cent. I sent it anonymously through a dozen different online portals to a dozen different charities. Women's shelters, orphanages, legal aid societies for people fighting men exactly like your father. A flicker of a memory came back to me. Robert, complaining a few years ago that his investments weren't performing as they should. He'd spent weeks on the phone with his broker, furious, unable to understand where the money was going. I had sat there, knitting a sweater, offering him tea, my heart pounding in my chest, a quiet, triumphant smile on my face that he had mistaken for wifely concern. It was the only power I'd ever had in our marriage, this secret rebellion. It was the only thing that kept me sane. The last withdrawal, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, I made it last week, after I got the call from the hospital. I wired every last penny to a clinic in Arizona that specializes in rare childhood diseases. I sent it to Maria for Leo. My collapse moment didn't come with tears or screaming. It came with a profound, earth-shattering quiet. The truth was finally out, all of it. The weight I had been carrying for 50 years, the weight of his secrets and my own, simply lifted. I felt light. Daniel sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. The man who had walked in a few days ago, so sure of himself, so entitled, was gone. In his place was a broken boy who had just learned his entire life was a lie. Sarah was sobbing uncontrollably, looking at me with new eyes, as if seeing me for the very first time. Not as a gatekeeper, not as a confused old woman, but as a person. A survivor. The truth was far more complex than they could have imagined. I wasn't the victim they needed me to be so they could take control. I wasn't a senile widow. I was the woman who had fought a silent, 50-year war against a tyrant, and in the end, I had won. I had dismantled his tainted legacy piece by piece, right under his nose. The money they were obsessed with was gone, used to clean up the mess their father had made of the world. A few days later, the house was quiet. Daniel and Sarah had retreated, shell-shocked, to their own homes to process the demolition of their past. They needed time. Maybe they would come back. Maybe they wouldn't. For the first time, I realized I was okay with either outcome. My life was no longer tied to them, or to the memory of the man who had controlled us all. I packed a single, small suitcase. I took the photo of the young, laughing girl from the broken box and put it in my purse. I walked through the rooms of the grand house one last time, no longer a prisoner in its gilded cage. The expensive furniture, the silver, the paintings, they meant nothing to me anymore. They were just things, props from a play whose final act had just ended. I left the front door key on the mahogany desk. They could have the house. They could have what was left. I didn't want it. The house wasn't a home. It was a monument to a lie. My freedom was the only inheritance I ever truly wanted. As I stepped out into the bright sunshine, I took a deep breath of fresh, clean air. I didn't know where I was going, and it didn't matter. At 70 years old, after a lifetime of waiting, my real life was just beginning. I was finally, completely, gloriously free. Comment which part of the story left you speechless.